Can you tell me a little bit about your background? Where did you get your undergrad, your master's, and any advanced degrees?
I did my undergraduate degree and my master's degree at California State University, Chico. And then I did my PhD at University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Could you tell me a little bit about this study? What were you and your colleagues looking at?
I had done a series of studies looking at the role of nonverbal signals in spreading attitudes and biases to kids. So I had done several studies looking at this, basically seeing the extent to which kids would sort of acquire biases from observing other people's nonverbal signals. And so we had video recorded all of those sessions. So we had sort of this archive of recorded sessions of kids watching these videos in which nonverbal biases were displayed. So that means that there was an individual who displayed more positive nonverbal signals, so more sort of like smiling, leaning in, warm tone of voice to one person, and more negative. So more sort of like hostility, negative facial expressions, things like that toward another person. And so we had all of this sort of archival footage of kids watching these videos. And I had sort of noticed when I had run these sessions, when I'd observed them, that kids seem to sometimes be sort of mirroring those facial expressions or mimicking them while they watch the video, which was not necessarily something I expected. So it was something that sort of I was like, is that happening, that they're doing that? So we decided to go back and look at those videos and go back and code them and basically go back through and record, were they actually, each time they watched a video, were they showing mimicry of the videos, and then also looking at whether they were mimicking the positive facial expressions or the negative ones, and basically look at whether that predicted whether or not they sort of caught the bias or acquired the bias that they were exposed to.
How many kids were involved? What were the ages?
We had somewhere around 300, like just under 300 kids total for that combined study, and they were all they were primarily 4 and 5-year-olds. I think there were a few 3-year-olds, but they were preschool age, mostly 4 and 5-year-olds.
What age exactly do kids start developing these type of mimic behaviors and then generally these biases?
Well, mimicking in general, we see essentially from like incredibly early on. So we'll see with like infants that they will mimic like sticking their tongue out or something like that. So essentially it's happening right off the bat. We're seeing kids are showing signs of mimicking others' behavior or like facial expressions. In terms of biases, it sort of depends on how you measure it. So as soon as we essentially can sort of start asking kids who they like better, so like around sort of 3 years old, when we can start sort of reliably asking kids about that, they're already showing intergroup biases. So they're sort of showing favoritism for some groups in their social environment over others. And depending on what sort of other metrics that are used earlier on. So there's studies in infancy looking at like looking time and things like that. So how long kids or infants will look at people in different groups and things like that. We're already seeing biases in those types of metrics in infancy as well.
Depending on the length of time that they're looking at someone, what does that say exactly?
That's part of why it's a little bit complicated in terms of like how should it be interpreted. And so it's sometimes been interpreted that kids will look longer, infants will look longer at things that they like more. And so so if they look more, and you can see that with things that we know that infants would feel more positively toward than other things. And then that has been sort of generalized to try and look at things like people of different groups and things like that. So looking at like people of different races, and that how long will kids look at people of different races, which certainly has a lot to do with who they are exposed to in their environment. So like who are the people that they're seeing in their everyday life, who are their caretakers, things like that. And that people who look more like their caretakers, they will generally they'll show a visual preference to look at people that look similar to their caretakers.
What did you have the kids do exactly, and for how long?
They came in to the lab or sometimes, so in the original study, some of them we collected at schools, but for everything that made it into the archival study, it was all in the lab where we had our video cameras. So kids watched a video in which they saw two people interacting. So we just told them, you're gonna watch a video of this person and this person. So we introduced the people in advance and then said, you're gonna see a video with those two people. And then they saw a video with those two people and one other person, which was the person displaying the nonverbal signals. And the videos were actually edited so that the target who received more positive nonverbal signals and the target who received more negative nonverbal signals, they were, we basically edited the video so it was the exact same response they showed whether they received positive or negative. So it had nothing to do with how the targets themselves responded, because we edited it so it was literally the exact same video of the person, whether they received positive or negative, and we did counterbalancing so that it wasn't always the same person who was the target of positive nonverbal signals. In some conditions they were positive, on some they were negative. So we sort of counterbalanced all of those things to make sure it really was about the nonverbal signals that were displayed by the expressor, by the person who was varying their nonverbal signals. And so yeah, we had kids watch those videos, and then after that asked them a series of questions about who they liked better of those targets, who they would want to. So we had a toy, and we told them that we were going to share the toy with one of those people from the video. Who should we share the toy with? And then we asked a series of other questions in some of the studies. It sort of varied across which version we were doing, where we asked them things about how much they liked members of their group more broadly. And so in some versions of the study, we told them that they were members of these larger groups, and we showed them maps of the places that they were from. So some people were from Redvale and some people were from Black Pine, and they wore a black shirt or a red shirt. And we looked at whether they showed a general preference for people from one place over another based on the nonverbal signals that were directed toward the person in the red shirt and the person in the black shirt, and found that if the person in the red shirt was receiving more negative nonverbal signals, that we saw a bias in general against the people from Redvale overall. So it's like that one individual person from Redvale received more negative nonverbal signals. We saw that kids would actually generalize that to people from Redvale in general and favor people from the other group, favor people from Black Pine over Redvale just from that one sort of incident. So that sort of struck me as being really important, that, in the absence of other information, kids could develop an attitude about an entire sort of nationality based on this one sort of nonverbal incident.
Can you describe some of the nonverbal cues that the expressor was giving?
It was a lot of tone of voice, so like vocalics, because they said the exact same thing to both people. So they greeted both of them with a hello, but one of them was hi, and the other one hi. So it's the facial expression, but also those vocalics, the tone of voice, and some sort of body movement in terms of, am I sort of leaning in, or were they leaning away? Those were the sort of cues, and they were rather exaggerated in this case to make sure that kids were catching them.
What exactly did you find when you looked at that?
When we went through and did that analysis, what we found is that we were seeing a substantial amount of mimicry. So I think it was somewhere right around the ballpark of 50% of the kids were showing at least some mimicry of the videos. And then when we looked at the positivity, so overall we saw some tendency for kids who mimicked to be more likely to favor the target of positive nonverbal signals. So it's just sort of like catch that bias. But then when we broke it down by positive and negative, we found that really mimicking the negative was important. So when we pulled those two apart, then mimicking the positive didn't really matter, at least in our data, but mimicking the negative really mattered. So basically, each additional time they mimicked negative nonverbal signals from the video, they were substantially more likely to sort of catch the bias and favor the target of more positive nonverbal signals. So mimicry of the negative nonverbal signals seemed particularly predictive of whether or not kids were going to sort of catch the bias they were exposed to.
So basically, if a person were to have these positive nonverbal cues towards someone, the kid would be like, okay, yeah, they're a good person. But if it's negative, they're like, yeah, this person's bad.
That's kind of what it seems like, where, in some of the positive, what we were observing as positive mimicry could have been more, kids who were just, enjoying watching a video, having a good time, and they were showing some positive facial expressions, which we interpreted as mimicry, but maybe they were smiling for a different reason, because smiling is more of like a typical social response, versus if they were sort of like frowning and showing these really negative facial expressions while they were watching the video, it's pretty clear that was probably not, it was based on the video and not based on some other part of the social context. And so there could be some precision of measurement thing going on there, but it also seems like if they mimic negative nonverbal signals, they sort of are definitely a lot more likely to catch that attitude.
What do these findings suggest?
I think that they suggest that the nonverbal signals that kids are exposed to are really important and can have a pretty big impact on the attitudes that they acquire toward other people and other groups. And so, and that perhaps they might be particularly likely to catch them if they mimic them. So if they sort of are really engaged to the point that they're actually sort of replicating those facial expressions, but that to really sort of pay attention and think about the nonverbal signals that kids are exposed to, and that if they are communicating a message that maybe is inconsistent with the attitudes we want them to develop, then noticing that, and that being a time where we recognize we need to sort of intervene, that we need to give some explicit information that's going to contradict that. We need to do something else to make the inputs not be stacked in favor of acquiring that bias.
What tips would you have for parents to do that?
We created in the context of these fictitious groups because we wanted to be able to talk about the acquisition of a bias that kids previously had no attitude. So I talked about the different nationalities, the Red Veil and Black Pine. So we made those up so that we would know kids did not have any pre-existing attitudes toward people from Red Veil and Black Pine because they don't exist. But in reality, I'm trying to create an analog for actual nationalities or actual racial groups. So the idea here is thinking about if kids are exposed to these kind of messages about members of other racial groups, for example, what can we do to address that? And I think one thing, if we think about the context of the US, would be to have conversations with our kids about people in other groups, to talk to them about race, to talk to them about bias, which certainly when we think about white American parents is something that they definitely tend to want to avoid or do avoid. In most of all of the data that I'm aware of, as well as the data we have collected in other studies, that is something that parents are definitely even if they see the value in it, they're tending to avoid it, in part because they're concerned that they're going to actually create a bias as opposed to reduce biases. And in all of the work that I'm familiar with, as well as some data we've collected ourselves, having those types of conversations is generally always beneficial. So my suggestion is for parents to talk to their kids about members of different groups and about biases. And that oftentimes parents might think that their kids are too young to understand those messages, but we can sort of tailor them to address the age that your child is, and that it's really never too young, and especially if you're observing in their social environment that maybe they are being exposed to that, because they probably are, and that then it's certainly not too early because they're getting those inputs from somewhere else. So if you don't give them the information to sort of contextualize that, to tell them that that's not really fair that that's happening, that's not, I don't agree with that, then they don't have any reason to think that you do disagree with it and that you don't think that they should be, kids are sponges that are absorbing information from their environments. They are picking up on all these subtle cues so we don't have to explicitly teach them everything. But sometimes there may be messages that they're picking up passively, like this kind of thing from nonverbal signals, that we don't want them to pick up on, or we don't want to shape their biases, so we need to give them that additional explicit information to contextualize it, to help them make sense of it in a way that isn't just to catch a bias and then sort of be a part of that system of having biases and spreading them to, other people as well.
It's a difficult conversation to have. What are some lines that parents could open up to talk with their kids about these biases?
A recent study that we did, we exposed parents and kids to these little sort of video vignettes in which we showed incidents of subtle and more blatant racial biases going on. So they were little, like these cartoon vignettes that were really brief. But then we gave parents an opportunity to talk about those with their children. And what we found is that when we sort of gave them this situation, so where they sat down and their task was to watch this video with their kids and then talk about it, then they sort of figured out ways to talk about it. It was sort of, now we're in the context. We've just been exposed to this thing. We're like, oh, that wasn't very nice that happened to this kid. Why might that happen? And so talking about a particular event might be a way to start. So looking for sort of scenarios in which you're seeing unfairness go on or some sort of bias happening. So if a parent does observe something at school, I think a lot of times those sort of things happen and parents feel really uncomfortable and they kind of go, oh my God, I hope they didn't notice that. Let's just and instead maybe taking it on would be the way to go, I noticed, did you hear what, your friend Becky said at school today? And, why do you think she said that? And starting to have start a conversation rather than avoiding the conversation. And we also did things within this study where we prompted specific sort of things, so sort of empathizing with different people. So sort of saying, how would you feel if that, had happened to you? So thinking about being in the position of the person who's the target of bias, and thinking about why might people have these attitudes? Why is this happening? So really just sort of stimulating conversation. And what our data has shown is that you can't really go wrong. As long as you're not explicitly expressing bias and encouraging bias, if you're just opening up a dialogue, you probably might feel uncomfortable, and that's okay, because it's not something you normally do. We often feel uncomfortable when we're doing something that's new to us, but that all of our data shows you can't go wrong in terms of exacerbating bias, and usually you're sort of giving additional information and context for kids to make sense of the implicit messages that they're getting out there in the world.
You mentioned earlier that for white parents, talking about race was a little bit more difficult. Have you found that it's generally more open to talking about race for other groups?
We haven't collected that data, but there's lots of data out there that indicates that within the US, members of racial minority groups, so basically, are much more likely to talk about race and to talk about differences and things like that. And some of that is probably necessitated by the situation where if you are a member of a minority group, if you are more often the target of biases, then just ignoring them and pretending like they don't exist might not be a very adaptive way to approach it. That actually talking about it and making sense of the context and why maybe sometimes you're not treated the way you should be, maybe sometimes things aren't fair for you, rather than just ignoring it, actually taking that on is important, and that it sort of brings that conversation on, even if so that it has to come up. And also there is some evidence that basically these types of conversations do become more common in white families when they are in a context in which they are. So if they're like white children going to a school in which they are actually like the racial minority at that school, or that they or that it's a very diverse school. So it's not like they're a clear majority. So when they're in more diverse contexts and maybe more likely to suffer the consequences of sort of intergroup dynamics and potentially experience some negative consequences in that respect, then we see in white families an increase of talking about some of these things. So it seems like everybody, when they're in that context, is more likely to actually talk about group dynamics and talk about race, but that is more often necessitated for people who overall are underrepresented within our population.
For your study, were there any numbers to how many kids did you see actually mimic the negative behavior versus the positive?
It was much more common to mimic the positive. So that I do know off the top of my head. It was, I think it was about twice as often that kids were mimicking positive versus negative. And we had sort of a distribution where, you know, there were some kids that only mimicked positive, there were some that did both, there were some that, you know, did quite a bit of positive mimicry, but some negative as well. And then I think we also had some who just mimicked negative. So there was some variability, but it was definitely much more common for kids to mimic the positive.
Do you have any idea to why is that?
Part of it might have to do with some of what I was talking about before of like there might be other things. So like if we're talking right now and that when I smile, I could be smiling because I'm enjoying this conversation with you. I also could be smiling because you smiled at me and I'm like mimicking or like mirroring that back to you. So there's sort of multiple sources of that mimicry or like what would appear to be mimicry, where if I'm smiling because I'm enjoying this conversation, that's not mimicry, but it might be indifferentiable. Like you can't tell the difference between why I'm smiling. Whereas there isn't a lot of reason for me to have negative nonverbal signals within this social context. And so there's just less opportunity for that to come up is what I'm sort of thinking. And there may be just sort of more of a social norm of mimicking positive nonverbal signals versus negative.
Positivity towards them is probably not as high as if compared to the person that's getting the negative verbal cues.
Is it being driven by feeling positive toward one person or negative toward the other? Like what is sort of driving this? And because everything that I have set up is pitting the two against each other, so I don't just say how much do you like this person who received positive nonverbal signals, or how much do you dislike, or how much do you like this person, because it's all relative to the other. So yeah, I do think it's a little bit hard to say. There is some research showing kids' reactions to nonverbal signals, and essentially it seems that what matters is that there's a discrepancy. So there was a study that Libby Bray and Kristen Schutz did where they were looking at teachers' nonverbal signals and showing that teachers were sort of so similar to my studies, kids were watching a video of nonverbal signals and teachers were displaying nonverbal signals toward students. And they were looking at how kids responded if they were comparing someone who received positive nonverbal signals versus neutral, so just sort of not very strong one way or the other, just sort of neutral, and then also neutral versus negative. And essentially, in one case, if neutral was being paired, like pitted against negative, then they thought that the neutral person was better. Versus if it was positive versus neutral, then they thought that the positive was better and the neutral was worse, which makes sense. And I think that probably a lot of what we're seeing in the real world, it's going to vary based on, you know, if I'm used to seeing my mom is like a really, really expressive, warm, friendly person, and I see her greet someone and she's sort of like, oh, hi, it's nice to meet you, and then just like moves on, then I may very well have got the message that like that is a person that we don't feel very comfortable with, that maybe we should avoid. Versus, you know, if I had a parent who was not very expressive and was fairly stoic, then that might have been meaningless information, or maybe that was even her being really friendly. So I think that it really depends on what our comparisons are and what sort of who we're learning from and how much we know about them and what we know about their sort of like set point of what their behavior typically is. And sort of gathering this base rate information and what deviates from the base rate within our environment.